All right, hello everyone. I'm Nicole Peterson, and I'll be co-hosting today's speaker session. So I'd like to thank you all for joining us for our SMA UK MOD panel discussion entitled Post-COVID Scenarios, What Data and Tech Choices Can Steer Us to a Better Future. I'd also like to thank today's panelists, Dr. David Bray, Dr. Matthew Burrows, Dr. Divya Chander, and Dr. Jason Matheny for taking the time to speak today. So before we begin, I just have a few quick housekeeping items. So we'll be having a virtual Q&A session at the conclusion of the panel. So just throughout the panel discussion or during the Q&A session, feel free to submit your questions via the live event Q&A chat. It's 2 speech bubbles. One of them has a question mark. And feel free to submit your name and affiliation before your question, or if you prefer for your name to not be used, just feel free to submit your question anonymously. You can also vote on which questions you'd like to be addressed first by hitting the like button next to the question. So now I'm going to briefly introduce today's panelists before I turn the floor over to them. Dr. David Bray recently accepted a leadership role to incubate the new Global Center with the Atlantic Council. He also provides strategy to both boards and startups, espousing human-centric principles to technology-enabled decision-making in complex environments. We also have Dr. Matthew Burrows, who serves as the director of the Atlantic Council's Foresight, Strategy, and Risks Initiative and the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. And we also have Dr. Divya Chander, who is an anesthesiologist, critical care physician, and neuroscientist who works at the intersection of health, data, technology, and data security. She also leads 2 companies that were co-founded during the pandemic, Lucidify, a remote brain monitoring program, and Plexus, a company building the world's connected global immune system. And last but not least, we have Dr. Jason Matheny, who is the founding director of Georgetown Center for Security and Emerging Technology, or CSET. And he's also a member of the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence and the National Academy's Intelligence Community Studies Board. So now I'm going to pose the first question to today's panelists before we kick off the discussion. So that question is, what are potential post-COVID scenarios and what data and tech choices can steer us to a better future? So David, I believe I'm turning the floor over to you first.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that gracious introduction. Really great to be here with each of you all today, and really excited to have a interactive conversation, both with the panelists. It's great to assemble Matt, Divya, and Jason. I feel like we're a fun jazz quartet. And more importantly, we will go to interactive Q&A also as well at about the 40-minute mark, because we want to make this interactive. So first would like to turn to Matt, because I know you've put a lot of thought into what possible COVID-19 scenarios might be. And Matt, I'd ask you, what do you see as possible scenarios for the years ahead in the post-COVID-19 era?
Well, thanks, David. I have some slides, just 2 short ones, which lay out 3 scenarios which we in the Foresight, Strategy, and Risks initiative drew up and are really seeing which one is turning out to be the course for the world. And so the 3 are great acceleration downward, and I'll lay this out in a little bit more detail. China first and new renaissance. So you can go to the next slide. So great acceleration downward. I would say that we're still on this course, and this is basically that, all 3 of the major economic drivers in the world are struggling. China perhaps less so than the others, but still, in terms of they have an unemployment issue, they also have increasingly inequality that's coming out of the pandemic. And in this kind of environment, what you see is everybody beginning to blame each other, particularly the West blaming China for the virus to begin with, and the lack of transparency. And you have pre-existing trends, particularly led by the Trump administration, trying to undo some of the patterns that were established under globalization. So the big global supply chains, a lot of them very reliant on China. That has been going on now for the last 2 or 3 years, but is being accelerated in recent years by the Trump administration, particularly on tech. So that's what TikTok, Huawei, all the efforts, worries about China getting ahead, and efforts really to stem some of that development outside of, led by China, outside of China. So in this scenario, basically, you get a race to the bottom, and over time, I think, you're going to get into conflict. So this is the worst of all scenarios. The second one on China first is that China begins to, as we've seen, pull out, but spots an opportunity of basically the developing world helping it, while the West gets too preoccupied with its own problems. We've seen a little bit of this. There's obviously this vaccine war where China and Russia actually are trying to sell their vaccines, get countries to buy on to them. And also China has started to engage in debt suspension talks. This is the first time really under the World Bank aegis. And then in this one, because the US and Europe have such a hard time economically, they begin to resent China's move ahead. And you see this more coalescence between US and Europe against China. I don't think we're quite there, and I think Europe particularly still wants to stand apart. They're more interested in strategic autonomy, but you could see over time, if the recovery really is lacking, that they begin to look for others to blame, and obviously China is a likely target. And finally, the new Renaissance, which I don't think we're anywhere near. And this is, I think you have to, I try to be apolitical in these things, but I think we have to say it would have to be a new US president. It's not clear if that, Biden is very strongly anti-China as well at the moment. But this is where you really try to reinvest in international. Sorry, I got some construction and I've tried to find the quietest corner. But
are they with the Chinese government? Just checking that.
Yeah. Anyways, you reinvest in the global institutions and use this as a wake-up call for other big challenges like climate change. So this is a new way of getting back into multilateralism. And I will step out for the moment while this is going on and leave it to somebody else in a more quiet area.
Sounds great, Matt. I don't know if it's a big conspiracy theory. I really think you should look out the window and see if we need to. They didn't want you to say what the way forward might be for the best of all possible worlds. But I really appreciate that, Matt, and we will circle back to that. And maybe real quick, if I could add context to what Matt just shared, because as mentioned, Matt's with Strategic Foresight at the Atlantic Council, and I'm at what's called the Geotech Center. And that's not, we don't do geospatial technologies. We did get calls in February and March from the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency saying, you're doing mapping. And we're like, no, geotech is the geopolitical implications of new technologies and data and how new technologies and data change geopolitics. And quite frankly, before COVID-19, that was a harder conversation to have with leaders, either in the public sector or the private sector. But COVID-19 has put in stark relief that the intentional choices that we make, whether it's nation states or private companies make with technologies and data, do have impacts on geopolitics. Not just the pandemic, but think about TikTok, think about WeChat, think about Huawei. there are plenty of examples in which the technology choices that are made by a society will have impacts. And what I want to do is layer on top of what Matt just said, and then I'm going to go to Divya, because Divya has a really great perspective on this as well. And I really appreciate, Divya, you joining us very early on the West Coast. I want to layer on top of what Matt just shared and think about, what if the future isn't the nation state at all? I mean, already we see in Estonia, you can become an e-resident of Estonia without living in it. We also see other examples, GDPR in Europe, General Data Protection Regulation. This is an effort to apply European rule of law outside of Europe. You actually have to treat someone who's a member of Europe in the EU, you have to treat them when it comes to data privacy as if they were in Europe, even if they're in your own country, which is a really interesting sort of juxtaposition against the Treaty of Westphalia. At the same time, you have China saying that essentially any data in their country, whether you are a Chinese company or an individual, or a foreign organization or individual, it's illegal not to have that data be available to the Chinese government. Just this week, we see China actually saying they're going to want to put forward new ways of doing data governance for the world. They feel like the West has fallen behind in their minds, and they want to help reshape that. And so data and tech have become not just what I would call instruments of statecraft, but actually instruments of how we get things done as systems and societies. And real quick, I want to give sort of the audience 3 things to think about. Where will conflicts present themselves between open societies like Europe, like the UK, like Canada, the United States, and others, versus closed societies, more like, say, China or Russia? The first is the area of trade. And I would say right now, the advantage when it comes to trade in closed societies is disproportionately larger than it is to open societies. Open societies, you need to allow anything to come in, including technologies that might do harm or covertly do things to your country. Closed societies, you can close those borders. You can say, we're only going to allow things within our country that we produce ourselves. You can artificially prop up industries, and as a result, have an unfair advantage when it comes to global competition versus more open societies. And so expect trade to be a battleground of whether it's invisible or visible conflicts in the next 5 to 10 years ahead. Second, you need to start thinking about what we need to be doing in the area of information environments. Again, with information environments, we need to recognize that, again, closed societies, you have a single narrative. It's state controlled. If you don't like it, your choices are you're fired, or worse, you're imprisoned, or ultimately killed, which is not what open societies can do. And so when it comes to information environments, again, closed societies seem to have the advantage, thanks to all the technologies we spent the last 2 to 3 decades producing, relative to open societies. And this raises a very interesting question about, again, how will open societies change how they play the game without resorting to censorship, without resorting to takedowns or unfair filtering that feels heavy-handed and essentially makes them become closed. Because we've seen misinformation attacks, but also thinking about what's going on the internet in terms of cyber attacks and things such as this. This is a case where, again, the very openness of certain societies puts them at risk for polarization and wedge issues. The third area is the area of governance. And this is the idea of how do you get things done, not just within your society or system, but globally as well. And this is the one area in which maybe in the long term, open societies may have the advantage. Again, closed societies can be very intentional about what they're doing with governance. And you see large countries, whether it's China, but other ones as well. Russia, which wants to also put forward its own new way, saying, look, the post-World War II era is out of date. It's falling at the seams. We're worried about NATO, that they want to replace it with something else that's more to their liking. And they have influence. They have funds. And if they recover first, as Matt said, they may be able to reshape a new world order different than the one that existed before. The question for open societies is the very things that make us open. The diversity of thoughts, the innovation, the fact that we allow competitive markets and we allow ideas to flourish and we allow a plurality of thoughts. Can we actually double down on that and make it a source of strength in terms of the diversity of perspectives, inclusion, the very things that right now are being protested in the United States, for example, in terms of historical non-inclusion, historical injustices? Can we correct that and instead move forward and say, we are actually celebrating the fact we're open because we believe it's a strength, and maybe pivot from playing the nation state game to being more of a network game that is selectively filtering and choosing what goes on in our network that makes us whole. With that, I'd now actually like to turn to Divya, because I know, Divya, you've seen a lot of what's going on as well, not just in the healthcare space with your medical background, but also what's going on with the pandemic response, the idea of an immune system for the planet. Maybe if you could share with us both your perspective about the short term, COVID-19, where are we going with that? How long is it going to take? And then second, where should we go in terms of using data and tech for good in the next 5 to 10 years ahead?
Yes, well, thank you, David. Thank you all for having me as part of this discussion. I know I'm not your typical participant. I want to say that both of you set up these scenarios quite well from different perspectives, and there's not much I don't agree with in terms of the way you've actually sketched out the way this could play out. I mean, the great downward trend, we always remain in partial lockdown. People are afraid to go out. They're afraid of where the next pathogen's coming from. Markets don't recover. People stop traveling. Education's impacted. And we exacerbate problems like food insecurity, civil unrest, and the balance of governments and styles, David, the way you so beautifully laid out, moves in a different direction. The other scenario, to put a little bit of a positive spin on it, is that data and tech come to the rescue and innovation flourishes. We use this as an opportunity to mitigate against future risk, to secure food, water, and climate resources. And we start really innovating in the biosensor space and start living with our planet more in harmony. And let me sort of describe this a little bit more, what I'm saying. One of the ways that I tend to look at what's happening to our planet is that it's kind of fallen out of homeostasis, out of balance. And this is where I wear my physician hat and I look at what the human system does. And we integrate tons of signals constantly. Our nervous system does it, our immune system does it. And both of those systems are searching for threats, but they're also searching for novelty. And they perform this sort of dance, this kind of a balance. And then our nervous system integrates that kind of information. And I think that the society that we want to imagine that we're moving towards is a society in which we use technology in the service of recreating what biological systems naturally do, which is to move towards a more homeostatic place. And this has come up before. By homeostasis, I do not mean status quo. I mean, when something goes up, something goes down, things, they dance in this place. In fact, the homeostasis of me when I was a teenager going through puberty is nothing like my adult self. It is not that I stayed static, and I was able to take new information on board. And that's what I think that we want to be approximating in this post-COVID world, is to take all of this innovation that David was describing that's actually going to help us create this potentially this new, this better world, and use that to provide resources to integrate new data sources as well. COVID is a public health crisis, but the signals that we may be paying attention to are going to be coming from the atmosphere, the soil. They may be coming from market signals. And so we need to be able to find a way to integrate all of this data. Trust was another thing that both of you brought up, and it's so important to this equation. As we share data, how are we going to do it in a way that citizens do not feel that their civil liberties are being threatened? And we have so many cultural approaches to this. In some parts of the world, people are very comfortable giving away their liberties for what they consider to be a greater public good. In other places, people are willing to give away their civil liberties for individual protections. But either way, it can take us to the one of the first two scenarios, that Matt laid out. And that's a place that I hope we don't get to. And I wanted to throw one final twist into this. I also have a background in space, both public and private space, and it is my fervent desire to see humans move out of this cradle and explore. But I also very firmly believe that we need to have an approach where we do not take sort of the uglier parts of our society with us, and that we move off this planet with the same sort of goals that we want to create our post-COVID society with. And so with that, I'll turn it over to the next panelist.
Real quick, before we go to Jason real quick, if I could ask you one quick rejoinder real quick, Divya, because I think you touched on something that would be very helpful. You know, you and I have talked about in the past about how the planet is getting instrumented in unprecedented ways, both what's available with commercial satellites that were previously only available to governments, what's happening with the Internet of Things, that we may very well be in 2 years or less, have upwards of 80 billion network devices on the planet relative to only 7.8 billion people on the planet. And that's, of course, going to be very tempting for some societies to do surveillance state or surveillance capitalism. But I think you've seen a third way forward that could actually use these technologies and actually create sort of do things that used to be only done by the intelligence communities of certain countries in the public space. Could you talk a little bit about that, and also talk a little bit about this idea of maybe data co-ops or data trust as a way to involve the public too?
Thanks for that question. So let me just touch on the idea of the data trust. We've also talked about this before. When you give your data for a sort of a public good, or to make sense and create new insights from it, you want to do this with the idea that that data will be respected and not used against you, whether it's for surveillance, whether it's to deny you insurance. And so the idea of public data trust is where that data is almost held to the same standard that we hold our fiduciary standards. Now, the question becomes, how do you actually achieve and accomplish these sorts of things? And I actually believe, in the same way you were talking about governance styles, I actually believe decentralization may be one of the ways that we achieve this. And the idea would be that we create networks that are decentralized. And there's a lot of approaches. Everybody thinks of blockchain when you talk about decentralization. There are many ways to achieve decentralization, but the key points are that data doesn't have to go through a vertical hierarchy and then have somebody else make the decision to choose to release it. As long as you have a way of authenticating the source of that data, the data should be able to enter a centralized network. And then it's in some ways, it's like a crowdsourcing function. But if you also, and there are means to do this as well technologically, if you secure data as it's being produced, and there is a key for literally every kind of data that is produced. So there are so many keys, it would be almost impossible to hack. You can actually secure data at rest and in motion and share it with the people that you choose to share it with. And it's almost as if we could all start participating as citizens in these kind of universal IRBs. An IRB is an institutional review board. We have these at academic institutions, and they basically are oversight and governance about how you can use patients' data in order to create new insights. We could have the entire planet participating in these kinds of things and saying, I'm okay with my data being used in this way. And in so doing, I almost feel like I should give a post-apocalyptic example. There's this website called, I think it's called Purple Air or something, and it's instrumented so much of the planet. And those air sensors are not as good as some of the others, but there are so many of them that when you actually average the signal that's coming in, you get a really good idea of what the air quality is like. That is how we can be using our decentralized networks.
Excellent. Thank you for that wonderful example of how we could do better sense making together, as opposed to just a few people doing it. Would now like to welcome Jason. Jason, really great to have you here. And given everything that you've done, I mean, you've dealt with novel new ways of doing the business of intelligence, R&D for intelligence, and now looking at what's happening with emerging technologies and the securities associated with them. Are we going to a Mad Max world, or do you have hope on the horizon in terms of what we're looking at?
I do have some hope. Thanks, David. Discussions like this always provide sort of a balance between the sort of morale boost and depression. So I'm hoping to come out of this with a bit of a boost.
Excellent.
I do think COVID has been, an accelerant to several existing trends, and I would guess that even after we recover from COVID, we'll see inertia in some of those trends. The first is an increase in protectionism. And reshoring is being framed sometimes accurately and sometimes inaccurately as supply chain security, and I think that will continue and maybe accelerate. The second is more multilateral pushback against China, as already discussed. The third is an increasing concentration of capital in large tech companies that are doing well right now and that enjoy positive feedback loops with pretty high barriers to entry, such as large-scale compute for machine learning, where we keep seeing returns to scale. which sort of induces then a Matthew effect of the rich getting richer in industry. At the same time, I think the COVID has brought to the surface some level of disappointment in technology. I think our collaboration platforms, our digital classrooms, certainly my sister is a school teacher and just, describes the difficulties that they're having getting the technology to work. And my audio participation is like, shows my own ineptitude on that front. And then our pharmaceutical development, which is much slower than I think people understood, even in a case where we're accelerating as quickly as we can on all fronts. So these technologies aren't as sophisticated as we'd hope. We know have sort of daily reminders of their limitations. I think one trend that really does give me hope, though, is that we're seeing a much broader level of appreciation in global health and biosecurity, which is, I know, something you've done outstanding work on, David. I'm really keen to hear your insights about this. But I think there's now a broader understanding of disease outbreaks as being key national and international security threats. And during my time in the intelligence community, most of the things that I worried about were disease outbreaks, whether natural, accidental, or intentional. I think that's now on the worry list for a much broader part of the policy community. And I hope we'll now see the investments that we need in disease surveillance and in rapid diagnostics, rapid vaccine development, testing, and manufacturing that's much more agile. I think COVID has demonstrated how vulnerable we are to a relatively mild pandemic. If we had a 1918 level pandemic, that had 5 to 10 times the infection fatality rate as this one, I don't know that we'd fare any better than we did a century ago, when we had 50 to 100 million people die in a single year. So we really need to make dramatic improvements to our public health preparedness and response. David, I really look forward to hearing your thoughts on this, since you've spent a lot of time both thinking about this and leading the way on improvements to public health. Over.
Humbled. Thank you, Jason, and really appreciate everything that you do as well. And I agree with you. In fact, I think how we initially met, it was trying to think about how we could actually make groups of experts and teams think better. And so a similar thing that I've been carrying, and maybe to give background to the rest of the audience, is back in 2000, I joined a little known program at the time called the Bioterrorism Preparedness Response Program. We were only 30 people. We were at the U.S. Centers for Disease Control, which itself at the time was 15,000 people. So we were 30 people in a very much larger organization. And about every 6 months, Congress said we didn't need to exist. And we said, well, quite frankly, they were just sarin gas attacks in 1995. Also, as the U.S. was paying former Soviet republics to disarm, we discovered they were actually stockpiling in what they called plague labs. Ostensibly, they were stockpiling smallpox as well. And it was scheduled weeks in advance to give a briefing specifically on what we would do technology-wise should a bioterrorism event happen. Unfortunately, that briefing was actually scheduled for September 11th, 2001 at 9 o'clock in the morning. And so 8:34, of course, the world changed. That briefing was postponed. We dealt with piling computers into cars. That was the state of information sharing in 2001, as you actually physically transport the computer. Dealt with the response of both New York and DC for 3 weeks, didn't sleep. Stood down from high alert on October 1st, ended up briefing the CIA and the FBI and others on October 3rd. And then the first case of anthrax showed up 24 hours later in Florida. Little background on that, we had only trained the state public health lab in Florida to detect anthrax in August of 2001. So sometimes it's really that close. But I think what that showed, after responding to that, we later responded to monkeypox in 2003, as well as West Nile and severe acute respiratory syndrome. Severe acute respiratory syndrome, and this is where Divya and I have also connected. The reality was, we actually knew about severe acute respiratory syndrome 5.5 months in advance of China finally admitting something's going on. And in fact, it wasn't China that officially admitted it. It was initially Vietnam, and then China cued in as well. But the challenge was, of course, we'd ask our State Department to ask what was going on, and each time they'd say nothing's going on here. But there were things that we saw. One of which was that the price of garlic had gone up tenfold, and we were monitoring that, and that's seen as a cure-all. And sure enough, if you look at what happened in COVID-19. In February, guess what's going through the roof in certain parts of China? Lots of garlic. And so those price signals were still there. The other way that we also knew, and now we can talk about it more because now commercial satellites have shown the same thing for COVID-19, is the patterns of human behavior changed. You may have been, you can actually find on the internet, there are analyses that were done using commercial satellite footage that show that hospitals with COVID-19 early on in China were having increased traffic, increased cars in the parking lot. And we know hedge funds do this too, just to figure out if a store is actually doing well or not and actually trying to either buy the stock or short the stock before their quarterly results are announced. And this shows, I think, a world that has fundamentally changed from 2010, is that public health has become data intensive in a way that's unprecedented. I mean, the way we used to do cohort studies in public health in the 1970s, 1980s, is you would fill out a survey and punch holes with whatever answer they gave, and then straighten out a coat hanger and run them through the punched in holes. And if the holes didn't line up, then your cohort study wouldn't work. But that was the state of data, which clearly is not the world we're in now. And I raise that because I think this shift to being data-centric, as well as this need for improved understanding of phenomenology or sense-making, because you look at what's happened with COVID-19, aside from, you know, the United States and possibly other countries having a less than optimal response to the pandemic, to which my response would be, unfortunately, if COVID-19 had happened 10 years earlier, we would have been perfectly prepared. But what happened in some respects, and we know it's not just the United States, we know that, for example, France actually did destroy PPEs it had stockpiled in 2013. The absence of a reminder that this matters made people get complacent, and when budgets were cut, this was one of the first things to get cut. And so we are not as prepared as we could have been 10 years ago when things were more fresh. But the other thing that I think we need to recognize is we now need to start thinking about how do we have early detection, early signals, early warning in a way that doesn't become surveillance state, but does things that used to be done exclusively by public health in a way that can do tipping and queuing from commercial satellites, tipping and queuing from the economic sector, tipping and queuing from other signals of human behavior, and it actually involves the public much in a way that Divya talks about, that involves data, whether it's data trusts that involve ombudsman or some other function in which the public is involved with doing data as opposed to having it done to them. And the example I would give is, you saw with Google and Apple is just one example, where they announced that they were going to launch a COVID-19 tracking app. And putting aside that I quite frankly do not think contact tracing works when you have more than 25,000 people because of false positives and false negatives. But regardless of that, even with the best privacy protections that they baked in and proposed with that contact tracing app, Pew found in April of this year that more than 3 out of 5 Americans were not going to use the app because they didn't trust it, because it was being done to them, that they just thought, well, Google and Apple must have some ulterior motive. And I think this is something that more and more governments are going to face, more and more companies are going to face, that if you don't find ways of doing data with people, they're going to be distrustful, because we do allow different narratives, which gets to the other challenge of the COVID-19 pandemic, which is the infodemic. I think I've seen some stats that even just with the 2016 elections that happened in the United States, the ratio of truthful to less than truthful fake and or misinformation information was 1-to-1, and that was 2016. There are now some projections that the amount of misinformation surrounding the COVID-19 pandemic in the United States is upwards of 70 to 80%. And so open societies, again, are highly vulnerable, not just to the flows of biological materials, but also to misinformation, weaponized information, and ultimately, where is a packet of information on the internet? Is it where it's sent from or received by? So with that, I see we've got lots of questions, and so maybe we're going to now turn to the Q&A portion, if that's okay, Nicole? All right. So one of the questions that we got is really sort of trying to think about, how do we deal with the fact that certain countries do intellectual property theft, do currency manipulation, and other nefarious actions? What should we do? And I think they're probably referring to a large country of 1.4 billion people, but it may also refer to some others. Maybe I'll go first to Matt, and then to Jason, and then to Divya for your thoughts about, should we just turn a blind eye to countries that do things that involve intellectual property theft or currency manipulation and other nefarious actions, or should we find other ways to respond? So Matt?
I think we should respond, but I don't think it should be this bilateral issue. I think it should be actually a multilateral issue. And obviously China is heavily dependent still on trade with, you know, Europe, US, other countries. Getting a coalition together on these issues is a way of actually I think, bringing about some changes. And you know, that's what I was trying to do with the third scenario is we need to rebuild those multilateral institutions that the U.S. actually was founded, but in the last 4 years, if not even before, it was beginning to walk away from.
Excellent. Thank you, Matt. Jason, do you have thoughts on what we should do about some of these issues? Are there ways that we can either get policymakers involved or private sector companies involved or maybe even tech approaches?
I think whatever we do, it really does need to be multilateral. I mean, one of the things that we've been looking at Georgetown's CSET is how export controls, for example, or investment screening that is unilateral, focused on a particular country just allows import substitution or investment substitution. So it's usually not going to be effective unless it's in cooperation with your allies. Now, I do think on issues like IP theft, but also on human rights abuses, we have allies who care about those things too. So building up a multilateral approach to enforcing the rules of fair play and enforcing human rights standards is something that that we can work with our allies on. Over.
Excellent. And you actually touched upon another question that relates to this that we got, and maybe I'll ask this of you, Divya, which is, are there any correlations between data, tech, and human rights in which societies can leverage more effectively as open societies relative to closed societies? So maybe if you could talk a little bit about your thoughts on data, and are there intersections between data, tech, and human rights? Oh, and you may be muted.
Apologies. In fact, I was going to mention it in response to even that last question. What's interesting is if you begin to use technology in the service of labeling data. So for instance, there are tags you can put into, let's say you created a synthetic organism for the sake of studying it or producing vaccines versus you did it for a bioterrorist sort of goal. You can actually label data in certain ways and tag them so that they can be authenticated. And it's this authentication process that can actually protect people, because knowing the source of something, even if it's anonymized, but knowing that the source is legitimate is a way to protect the rights of that source and also to legitimize that source. It's another way that we could ferret out things like, well, we're having a big problem with truth telling, right? And what's fake news and what's not. Yeah, data labeling is one of these ways. I also, you know, what you said about passive monitoring, I think this is another way to secure rights. In the same ways that satellites can actually assess human migration, I mean, they were also one of the first ways we discovered Uyghur camps. And so what I would say is that we need to almost have sort of a global multilateral sort of agreement on what our principles are as a society, and then how we might be able to use data in service of that. And it has to be something now, a new structure that's flexible, that can grow as new technology is integrated. But if we espouse what those principles are, we can start to instrument and make sense of things in ways and label them in ways that are sort of part of our sort of shared goals. That final piece is, what are our shared goals? Yes. I actually think that this is probably one of the most difficult things that we are dealing with right now, the multiple cultural and governance perspectives that exist. And we need to get this dialogue going again, because we are, the United States is becoming increasingly isolationistic, and I don't see how that's going to help us move forward in the world. And we need to build up, it may not be NATO, but we need to build new alliances, and alliances that are really, their sole goal is how do we want this planet to look? It can't be just across nation state borders any longer.
Well said. I appreciate that, Divya, and maybe if I could add to what you were saying, it may very well be that if the issues we have are involving the loss of intellectual property, the disrespect of privacy, and other things that are done by closed nations, maybe the solution is to take an inwards look at ourselves and say, where are we less than just, less than fair, and could do better? One of the things that we know, again, if we look at what's happening with the COVID-19 pandemic and what's happening economically, there are questions about shared equity in what an organization does. Again, we're coming on the heels of a past model in which oftentimes equity was in the hands of just a few, but recognizing that as the world has changed, maybe the answer for intellectual property is yes, there are the individuals or few that create the initial idea, but how do you make it so that the intellectual property of a company is something that all employees share value in, or the intellectual property of a startup? And as a result, if you get more people in your society involved in benefiting from that intellectual property, if another country does an offense, now it's not just a few people upset, it's the entire population of that country upset, which is much like how Estonia, again, I mean, yes, they're advanced when it comes to digital identities and becoming an e-resident, but I think what's even more ingenious about what Estonia did is, if a large country decides to compromise Estonia's systems and it's only Estonia's data, then quite frankly, it's only Estonia that's upset. But if they're allowing you to be an e-resident of Estonia and you're outside, maybe you're in the United States, maybe you're in Canada, the UK, or someplace else, and a large country decides to try and compromise Estonia's systems, and you're an e-resident of Estonia, even if you don't live there, you weren't born there, now you've got this global network of people that are upset, almost as a deterrence from that action of that large nation state. And so maybe if the problems we're facing are loss of intellectual property or other countries becoming more surveillance state-like, the way you change the game is, instead of it being done behind a curtain by a few people that are trying to stop them from doing it, which I think is the 20th century model, it's now figuring out how do you involve everybody so that when they do this offense, everybody's upset. And so that might be an interesting change. What I also like, Divya, that you said, and this actually sets it up well for Jason, you asked a question about how do we set shared goals. And I know, Jason, you've done a lot of work when it comes to trying to make better decision making, better predictions, better outcomes. And one of those key tenets is you have to have shared goals in the people that are trying to make the decisions or make the predictions. So do you have any thoughts about how we could do better ways of creating shared goals in cases where open societies have a plurality of perspectives?
Yeah, I mean, I think first would be more open platforms where people can specify goals and share judgments about those goals. And David, I know you and I have a shared appreciation for prediction markets and other sort of crowd forecasting platforms, in part because they allow people to make explicit what a question is that we're trying to answer and what people's beliefs about that question are in large numbers efficiently. So I would be thrilled by the prospect of democratic countries launching more prediction markets that incentivize pooling of relevant judgments about important events, whether those events are developments in technologies or geopolitical events or disease events. Over.
Excellent. And you made me think, why haven't we seen more prediction markets for the next pandemic? I mean, this would seem to be the time, if ever, to try and launch them. Maybe people forgot about prediction markets, but I agree. I mean, there seems to be better ways of doing this. All right.
There's an impressive one at Metaculus, MATACULUS.com. It's free, and it actually has, I think, among the more accurate forecasts of COVID that I've seen anywhere.
Wow. All right, that's a good reference, so we'll make sure to include it. Any other thoughts that you have about other early signs of more democratic ways of involving it so that's everybody doing it as opposed to just a few doing it? All right. There's no, go ahead, Divya. Yes.
Oh, I was going to say, I think another way to address this is if we think about our stakeholders as being everybody rather than just a select few, we will actually create intellectual property differently. An example is, as a public health person, I'm part of this neuro brain monitoring platform I have is we're going to be capturing a lot of people's neural data. Turns out you can use an electroencephalogram as a brain print to uniquely identify people. And there are very few ways that you can sort of hack around your own brain. And so one of the things I struggle with is, like, I would like to bank this data in the cloud so that it could be used for biomarker discovery for diseases. but I don't want to intrude upon the people's human rights that I'm collecting data from. And that's a very difficult balance to maintain. And so one of the ways I'm trying to get around this is not only by encrypting that data at the source, but giving ownership back to the people who've been generating that data. It's their brains. They ought to have some say and some right in how their brain signals are actually used. And if you build privacy, and maybe it's not just privacy, but at least protection, or this idea that everybody should share in the benefits rather than become commodities themselves. If I just wanted to sell their data to big pharma, that would be a very different model than me wanting to give them ownership and then asking if they would like to participate in biomarker discovery. And I think that this sort of, if you build this in with these sort of ideals in mind from the ground up, it really changes your position on intellectual property and commercialization. And that's one of these things that we can be doing with shared values.
Nice. And that actually leads to another question that we got, which actually asks more specifically, how do we get out of the deadlocks of data centralization and trust? And maybe I'll do an initial toss in this and maybe circle back to Divya, and then we'll circle to Jason and Matt on a different question involving national militaries and their role playing forward. But on the question of getting out of the challenges of the fact that people don't trust data right now, or they don't trust being data done on them or without their involvement. I think it really, I mean, imagine with COVID-19, if the United States had instead said, you know what we're going to do is we're going to work with the private sector, with governments at the state level, with the public, and we're going to announce citizen juries for each of the 50 different states, somewhere between 10 to 12 people, because reality is, thanks to our Constitution, public health actually is a state right. It's not a federal thing. And despite what the movies say, CDC does not show up in a helicopter unannounced. We have to be invited. But that said, imagine if they said we're going to have citizen juries in each of these different states that are really sort of serving as the ombuds function to oversee what's being done by the government involving data, what's being done by the private sector involving data, and also the arbiters. If there gets to be disputes of, you know, your data is incorrect, or it's not meshing with the data we have or what we're seeing, or you're using it in a way that we didn't agree to. And that way, it's sort of the idea that, you know, again, if it's a citizen jury where people can say, okay, you know, I may not have the time to spend diving deep into this, but I can look at, and I see a jury of 10 to 12 of my peers, they're now involved, and it's much more of a visible oversight, and it actually creates a mechanism in which both the private sector and the government are pressured to be more publicly mindful of being accountable. At the same time, in the United States, we know we do have a very large audit industry. Deloitte, KPMG, EY. I mean, there's a very large audit industry for financial things. This could actually create a new marketplace for making sure whatever you say you're doing with data, you're actually doing it. If you say you're going to forget it effectively after 2 to 3 weeks, you actually are forgetting it after 2 to 3 weeks. And as Divya, you mentioned, I mean, we do have immutable audit logs that could actually say, this person said you can only use it for 30 days. If you don't honor it, then you're now in violation of whatever you promised to do. So that's one example of getting out of the deadlocks of data decentralization and trust. Divya, I'd be interested in your thoughts as well.
Actually, you touched something really interesting. I was talking to our mutual colleague, Krista Pauly, recently, and she's just enamored by the idea of using CPAs for public data trust.
Oh, same here.
For exactly that reason, because I mean, we've given an entire profession, right? We vested in them this trust to maintain it, but we typically only think about this financially. And I think you're absolutely right. We need to start thinking about this on the level of data. And what happened with Facebook and Google and Apple, basically taking data and manipulating and using it for basically monetary gain, would that have happened if we had been looking at data in this way to begin with? I love the idea of citizen juries. It's a representative democracy if you think about it, right? Because you're asking this jury of your peers to represent your rights and your needs. And therefore, the one thing I would say is that composition of those juries needs to be a heck of a lot better than what we actually currently have for our juries, which are not quite as representative. And the reason for this is simply because there are a lot of voices, and they may be looking at their own data differently, whether it's public health data, financial data, data about their movement, their migration, data about where they were captured, their image was captured on CDC, whatever that type of data is. And so you do need some plurality of voices, but I think you also might need some algorithms to help us out, because I think with extreme plurality comes sometimes a little bit of a deadlock. But I think that building in privacy from the ground up and having this kind of representation is an important way to do this. And you've retouched on this idea of decentralization. And if we have general principles but a decentralized system, you can apply these algorithms within those networks in order to come up with those best practices and solutions.
Excellent. Thank you. All right, now I'm going to turn to Jason and then Matt. We have a question more on the military role, which is what do you anticipate the role of national militaries will play with both the response to COVID-19 and possibly, helping with the post-COVID-19 recovery? Should the traditional roles of military be rethought? So Jason, if you're okay with it, I'm going to go to you first on that, and then Matt.
So, the military has an important role in disease detection and disease response. And I think one underappreciated activity of DoD is both global medical intelligence, which is centered at the National Center for Medical Intelligence at Fort Detrick, but also DoD installations overseas, which collect health surveillance data, collect lab samples for circulating pathogens. So I hope that we'll see a boosting to those activities, as well as the State Department's activities involved in sharing health data, helping to facilitate CDC liaisons who have offices overseas. Unfortunately, in the last several months, we've seen a retreat for those sorts of international activities, but we really need to be doubling our efforts in that kind of international engagement. Over.
Excellent. Thank you, Jason, and well said. Matt, what are your thoughts about is there any changes in the military's role, both during the COVID-19 era and whatever scenarios are presented afterwards?
Well, I think Jason's right on. They play a very important intelligence role, and particularly in detection of, when we get into bioterrorism and some of those issues that, are likely to crop up because COVID actually is a good advertisement to terrorist groups, as this is a way of really disrupting your enemy. So, but I would emphasize, I think we need a whole of government approach, that it is just not the military. And I think if it's too militarized, then you get into problems of cooperation, particularly with other countries, China being the key one, that I think State Department needs to be boosted on this, and also civilian institutions like CDC, so that we actually rebuild that kind of cooperation. And where we really further, the development of networks of scientists. And I think one of the problems now with the visa restrictions and the restrictions on Chinese students and researchers, that's an advertisement to everybody that the U.S. Really is not welcoming other scientists from abroad. So I think that is those kind of measures, that we need to be still the global capital for talent and encouraging talent. And a lot of the revelations on all of these pandemics have come through the networks of U.S. scientists who have worked with Chinese scientists, and that's where we really need to further develop those networks. Excellent.
Thank you, Matt. Jason, recognizing you've got a bit of a time crunch, but maybe before you go, we've got a question about how will supply chains evolve in the post-COVID-19 era? Will we see more economies move to closed supply chains, or will we see supply chains become more globalized? And maybe if we could expand that a little bit up and lift up a little bit further and ask the question about, given everything you're looking at when it comes to AI, are supply chains fundamentally becoming different in terms of how they're actually done altogether? So if you're open to that, I'd be interested in your thoughts, Jason.
Yeah, great question. And this is actually one area where Georgetown CSET has a prediction market of sorts called Foretell. So if people go to cset-foretell.com, there are questions about exactly this topic. so people can weigh in with their judgments as to whether they think we'll start to reshore, for example, parts of our semiconductor industry. I think the places where there will be a lot of discussion about supply chain security and reshoring is likely to focus on pharmaceuticals, not only on, say, vaccine development, but also on the constituents, including, large-scale bioreactors, lyophilizers, the cold chain equipment, et cetera. The other place where we're seeing a lot of discussion because of its importance to AI is in microelectronics. And specifically, there's been a lot of concern about our reliance on supply chains that are focused in Taiwan right now. So we import most of our semiconductors from Taiwanese foundries, and that remains the center of gravity for most of the most advanced microelectronics that are used to power our data centers, as well as most of our individual devices. So it's a really important supply chain. It's one that you wouldn't want to be vulnerable to a crisis. Its location in such concentration in Taiwan also means that there's more IP theft and more poaching of talent than there might be if there were more manufacturing in the United States. So we're starting to see signs that the U.S. Industry base is interested in developing joint ventures with Taiwanese and with South Korean semiconductor manufacturers. I think that's hugely important because semiconductors are basically the foundation for everything else that drives our modern economy. It all ultimately comes down to electronics that are in one device, whether it's in personal electronics, in large-scale data centers, or even in biotech, which comes down to a lot of really hard computational problems. So figuring out what that supply chain should look like is really important. I think we're likely to see a substantial amount of reshoring over the next several years. Over.
Excellent, and thank you for that, Jason. And two real quick things that I would add, because we're also looking at it with the Geotech Center, is one, not so much on the chip side, but for the other sort of manufactured goods, there are certain companies, one of which is called Nanotronics, but there are others as well in the United States and also globally that are looking at using computer vision, where you essentially teach the machine what does normalcy look like in your manufacturing process and your supply chain process, not just where it's manufactured, but how it's shipped and how it operates and what you normally see. And so that if later, either in the manufacturing process itself or in the supply chain or distribution process or in how the chip or whatever the good operates, if something deviates, you can say, is this a software flaw, hardware flaw, or has someone put something on the chip that I didn't expect? And so that actually creates both the efficiency control to allow you to be decentralized, but operate as if you were centralized, but also have early warning if things are actually odd. The second thing that I would also raise as people think about supply chains, we've heard the announcement that the UAE and Israel are now apparently moving forward in more benevolent relationships towards each other. That might present an opportunity. I mean, we know Israel actually does lead away in some of the microchips that are produced. And then another possibility is India, which just has the sheer number and size similar to, say, China. And so could we see an interesting triangle emerge between Israel, UAE, and India? And is that something that either the UK or the US could help encourage joint partnerships, as you said, not just in the Pacific, but possibly between India, UAE, and Israel? Matt,
great
I'm going
to
turn.
David.
Go ahead,
Total
Jason.
agreement.
Yeah.
No, total agreement. I thought everything you said was spot on. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Jason. Before, I know you have a time crunch, before you have to exit, is there anything that you would like to impart to the audience before you have to transit?
Just gratitude. I mean, for folks to sign on to a discussion like this and take time out of their day, just extreme gratitude on my part. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Jason. Matt, I'm going to turn to you because we have an interesting, provocative question that says, what COVID-19 related innovations in surveillance technology and practice will change the way that countries and private entities do surveillance, both on their own domestic as well as their foreign populations? And I imagine that's going to be a nuanced answer because it's going to depend on the type of society. But I guess I'd be interested, Matt, do you have any possible things as you look down the trends in terms of how will surveillance change for different countries, both domestically as well as internationally?
Well, I think, there is a difference in how at least most of the Asian countries responded to COVID versus Western countries. And some of that, I mean, people are trying to understand why that is. Some of that is because, and you mentioned like MERS, they've had experience with other pandemics, so they react faster and they realize, you know, the difference between linear and exponential, and are more willing also to engage in the apps, the tracking apps. So, you know, I think there you may see a different pattern develop and I think it already exists, of more willingness to engage in that, less distrust of how the data is going to be. I'm not sure that, you know, people's distrust has changed that much. I mean, you know, going into COVID, I mean, we were thinking that maybe because you have this collective threat affecting everybody, you know, that you would want to engage a lot more on you know, tracking apps, more willingness to engage in, to allow governments to engage in surveillance. And I'm not sure that that's the case. You know, I think there's still, you know, as you just referenced, I mean, you know, there hasn't been the pickup on the apps that you would have thought, at least I would have thought. So, I mean, that said, I mean, there's quite a bit of surveillance that we do accept. I mean, the UK accepts having cameras about at every street corner, and increasingly in some US cities, you're also seeing a lot more surveillance by cameras. So, and that is premised on, you know, people believe this is a way of cutting back on crime, so that they're willing to you know, to be surveilled that way. So maybe over time, but I'm surprised we haven't engaged as much. The publics haven't engaged as much because of COVID.
Agreed, and good insights, and you're absolutely right that there seem to be some cities that seem to be okay with it for crime, and then equally there seem to be some, I won't say cities, but some citizens in cities that are also turning cameras around and pointing them at the police. And so, and it would be interesting to actually ask them, would they be okay with the same thing that's monitoring the police being monitoring them? But that's probably outside the scope of today's conversations. But Divya, maybe asking your thoughts from your perspectives, are you seeing shifts when it comes to attitudes for surveillance? And then a second question that we've also gotten, which is, how do we balance the need for openness with deliberate design choices for our digital future? And you may need to unmute yourself, sorry.
My apologies. Yeah, so there were a number of interesting things said. I'd like to speak to this idea about people not picking up on these contact tracing apps that actually are pretty good in terms of securing privacy. And to me, this all comes down to trust. Apple, Google, especially Google, people just don't trust them because they've siphoned off their data before and they've used it for other purposes. So why should they be trusted now? MIT is actually, and there are a couple of other companies as well in this space that are producing privacy-oriented contact tracing apps. And I would say that MIT might have a little bit more trust cachet with the population. So something like that might be deployed a bit more easily. The problem is that contact tracing apps, the way they're designed with privacy in mind, require voluntary cooperation versus the kind of contact tracing which is often done maybe in the East or in more Asian nations, where people willingly allow their face to be associated with their COVID status and posted if necessary. It's not just a liberal democracy, open closed society issue. It's cultural. It's that people in certain societies believe that their own data is the most important thing as an individual, whereas in other societies, people believe that it's okay to give up some of your privacy for the sake of a common good. And I think that perspective, those polarities, are going to be a very, very interesting one to balance. And the question is, can we come to something where we provide a way of still protecting that person? So maybe we shouldn't be talking so much about full data privacy, but we should be talking about personal protections and how things are not used against people. And I think if people had trust in that, they would be sharing data for the sake of public health and sense making much more frequently. You also asked me another question, which I apologize.
Yeah. So just basically asking, how do we balance the need for openness and I guess almost sort of like freewheeling and very intentional design choices is the question.
Yeah, and I'm also, if you don't mind, I'm going to actually combine it with a question I see in the Q&A,
sure.
which is somebody actually commented on how we might be using biological principles actually, and extending that analogy further, and how we might be using that to create order. Mm-hmm. And I think this is actually a great question. I had talked to one of our colleagues, Greg Marignac, about this once at Singularity in the energy sector about how to create plastic energy grids that would just respond to consumers' needs in any given moment. Any organism, but let's just take humans as an example, balance two features, right? So one is simple energy balance. By energy, I do not mean oil. I just mean inputs and outputs. You cannot have more outputs than there are inputs into a system. And the thing that requires the most output is the human brain. It takes a disproportionate amount of energy from the body. It takes 20 to 25% of your cardiac output, and it uses up most of the glucose. And so what happens is your brain, if you want to think that it's driving a lot of this homeostasis, it has a set of networks, and those networks are really plastic. And so what we do early in life is we lay down some rules so that it doesn't become so expensive every single time a new input comes in. And by input here, I mean stimulus. So stimulus comes in, and now a stereotyped output comes out simply because it's expensive to cogitate about every single decision you need to make. What we could be doing is creating systems on design principles that are used by organisms, where we understand that energy balance is primacy because you cannot have more outputs than input. You have to maintain the organism, but within that, you set certain principles, and this is those agreed upon global standards for the system, and now you build in rules. You develop these systems, these networks, more like neural networks, where they can be plastic and learn, and they're actually inherently good at balancing input-output functions. They throw some noise into the system. A lot of people don't realize this, but neurons compute using chaos and noise. They are not deterministic. And when you put all of this together, if we were to use that as the basic fundamental design principle of the entire data fabric we are speaking about, build it like a nervous system, it would be energy efficient. I mean, our brain is as efficient as a light bulb, right? It does all this processing with watts of power. And if we just built that within the system, so it could be plastic, but we knew it had to balance energy, I think we would come out with design principles that would actually surprise and shock us. But we would just let them fall out. So
I'm with you 100%. And that actually, I know you didn't, maybe you planned it, but this is actually a great segue to another question we got, which is how would we actually change the investments in tradecraft around infectious diseases and the intelligence community? And maybe I'll sort of riff on what you just shared, Divya, and then maybe turn to Matt. But sort of the idea that imagine if you went back in time to the 1920s. And, 1920s, the problem was burning buildings. They killed people, they destroyed property. But you said, you know what, there's a solution we can do to solve this. It's called smoke detectors. They'll be built by the private sector, not by governments. They'll be installed in individual buildings, homes, and everywhere. They'll tell you approximately where the fire is, possibly the building and the floor. They'll alert the fire department to respond. And on top of it, they may activate a sprinkler system as a remediation effort before people arrive. People would think you're crazy, but sure enough, we now have smoke detectors. We need that same sort of instrumentation for the planet, very much like you said, in terms of responding to stimulus in the human brain. I would submit that the intelligence community was built in a period in which data was scarce. I mean, the amount of data that we saw in the 1950s was like peering through a very small funnel, and we organized for that. And quite frankly, and this is not a new concept, I was with a national commission that reviewed the R&D efforts of the U.S. intelligence community in 2013. You can find one unclassified report on the internet. There's also some classified ones for those who have access. But one of the conclusions we had was blow up the funnels, that we are still operating in a world in which we still think data is scarce, when in fact what we know is in 2 years or less, there's going to be upwards of 120 zettabytes of data on the planet, which to put in perspective is possibly twice all the conversations we've had as a human species. And so the way we are organized, much like in public health, which is not data-centric at the moment, and we're surprised that we can't respond to COVID-19 well, maybe the intelligence community needs to do the same thing and think about the equivalent of smoke detectors for pandemics, but also smoke detectors for civil unrest, smoke detectors for possibly planning some bad action or things like that. That's not done through just the exquisite means, but again, involving the public. And maybe, I know, Matt, I may be handing you a hot potato, but I don't know if you have any other things you'd like to add to that, or we can turn to the next question. So.
Well, all I would say is that the incentives within the intelligence community are always more on the clandestine side. And this is what Congress asked for, and including how many reference to clandestinely collected intelligence was used in the president's daily brief or, in this or that report. And it's been very, obviously there are people there who are very interested in this, in the open source and developing that. I don't think you have the analysts trained up. And this was evident like in the Arab Spring. Mm-hmm. And so that's also a problem of, the analysts have to have a better understanding how to use it, as well as obviously there has to be much more of an incentive put on using it and analyzing it. The original conception, as I'm sure you know, of Truman for the Central Intelligence Agency was all information.
Right.
Because this was coming out of the disaster of Pearl Harbor. But he was envisioning open source and everything. And I think over the years, it got captured a little too much on the clandestine side. But I think with upcoming generations of analysts, that, the internet natives are much more comfortable with data. And so the talent exists. I think they just need a real push.
Well said. And I think there was, I recall a study that was done, this was after the events of 9/11, so it was probably like mid-2000s, but I recall a study that was done where they took the same information and labeled one as open source and then labeled it as also top secret. And they gave it to different decision makers and they asked, which of the two do you value more? And of course, they put more weight, even though it was the same exact information, with the one that was labeled that somehow this was hard to get, therefore it's valuable. And I think that just shows the biases that are present.
Yeah, that's incredible.
Both the 9/11 and the WMD Commission reports, they always emphasize much more collection of the open source. And these were, congressionally mandated, but they don't follow oftentimes the lessons that are set out by their own commissions.
Maybe we just need to hide the markings and just say this came from a source and just not tell you the level.
Well, here's the thing. Well, first you want to make sure it's an authenticated source, right? That is something we talked about, right? Because there's a lot of ways to throw. If you throw too much noise into a system, then you can sort of overwhelm that balance. But the kind of intelligence you're talking about, Matt, I just don't think that humans are going to be capable of integrating the amount of data that David's referring to, and I think we really are looking at humans augmented by machine intelligence. And the interesting thing is we can deploy lots of algorithms. Recently, I don't know if you guys have heard, but there was an algorithm that was put to trying to tie together all the disparate effects of COVID-19 on the body, whether it was on the lung, whether it was on the brain and its neuroinflammation. Why does it cause cardiomyopathy in young, healthy people? What's it doing? And it came up with something that not a single human has come up with yet. And that is that all of these pathways could be unified by something called the bradykinin signaling system. And when I read that, I was like, oh my God, of course, because it binds to the ACE, receptor. And in medical school, we all learn that when people who are taking blood pressure medications and they're taking ACE inhibitors, those who don't like those ACE inhibitors and get a cough, it's because of bradykinin. Bradykinin is that pathway. And I'm like, how did we not see that? It was sitting in front of us the whole time. Now, this may not turn out to be the case. It's a hypothesis, but amazing intelligence, right? And that's something we should have seen. My only concern about algorithmic intelligence is if it becomes too much of a black box and we don't understand the thinking underneath it and how it came to that. We could also have algorithms, as we know, that have bias that are inherently built into them, or that are using rules that we don't like and we don't agree to as a society in order to make decisions and to see patterns. But I really do think that this sort of partnership between human and machine is going to be incredibly important moving forward.
Well said, and I liked what you mentioned, that it's a partnership as opposed to a black box. We know, for example, the case of Google flu trends, it worked for about 2 years and then they overcalibrated it, and then all of a sudden it was predicting that the flu was going to happen in the summer. And so algorithms work until they get overtrained, and then they usually fly off the wheels. And I think there's a lot of AI hype out there, but like you said, it helps to tip and cue and say, maybe you as a human should pay more attention to this and see if it actually is present. We also had two interesting questions that sort of are kind of curious questions. One was, and maybe I'll tackle this and then see if either of our panelists want to do it too. Should data as an entity have rights itself? Should we give data itself a right to privacy or survival? I guess maybe this is showing I'm a scientist. I'm a post-positivist. I believe that we can approximate truth but never actually get there. But I think data is simply observations of the universe. And unless we're going to start saying we should give rights to observations and electrons and things like that, no. Now, will there ever be a chance where we actually should give rights to an algorithm or to a system of algorithms? That gets a little bit more interesting, but algorithms are only as good as the observations they've made. As one who currently has a 3-year-old, I'm watching them make sense of their universe. But I don't know if I would give rights to data, but I could see 5 to 10 years from now saying that this collection of algorithms has some collection of rights. Again, I don't want to necessarily put on the same pedestal as what I would call human and or animal life, but I could see something new there. I don't know. That's kind of a curious question from our audience. Divya, Matt, do you want to jump on that, or do you want to just pass on and go to the next one? Maybe I'll jump to the next one, which is
I actually do have an opinion. I actually agree with you about the observation versus algorithm. I don't want to call it a divide, but maybe it's sort of like it's some kind of a threshold. What's interesting is, that some people have actually advocated, for instance, for robots having rights. And robots, to some extent, are a collection of algorithms. And if you really want to take that to its extension, its natural extension, my brain is also a collection of algorithms, right? And so at some point, does a collection of algorithms become so interconnected, which is one of our working definitions of consciousness, and so function connected and so capable of integrating information that it takes on a life of its own? And when you begin to put algorithms, and potentially algorithms combined with machines, into this context, that becomes actually quite interesting. Another question that comes up sometimes is whether or not machines and algorithms will have a right to the fruits of their own work, right? Do they get a
And right now USPTO says no.
I think these are interesting questions. So I think that I think data in and of itself, you're right, David, it's an observation of the universe. But as you begin to move collections of data and systems that begin to form, because systems self-aggregate and they develop a kind of intelligence on their own, where do we draw this line, and where are those thresholds? And, we're going to have to start asking those questions at some point. I don't think we're quite there yet, but
in time. Maybe in about 5 years, and hopefully the Atlantic Council is going strong and at the forefront of these issues. Okay, we have 2 remaining questions. I think we answered the one at the top, but if not, maybe if the person has additional questions, they can ask us. But we have 2 remaining questions. One real quick, which is common good a fantasy, or is it something that we should think about? And maybe what I'll do is to tip and cue, and then I'll go to Matt and then Divya before we go to the last question. Is common good a fantasy? I would say, we talked earlier about goals and that you have to have shared goals. And so I would say common good is really shorthand for what are the shared goals that make any community truly define itself as a community. And if we lose shared goals, whether they're at the community level or the society level or the national level, then we're kind of going back to tribalism and partying like it's 3,000 years ago. And so I think common good, I would not say is a fantasy, but you are seeing extreme polarization, at least in the United States, and I know maybe our friends in the UK are seeing it too, but it's not unprecedented. I mean, we've had this before. In the 1800s, President John Adams and Vice President Thomas Jefferson actually waged in misinformation about each other. And these were president and vice president. Thomas Jefferson claimed that John Adams wanted to go war France when in fact he didn't. And John Adams and his wife called Thomas Jefferson the devil, which back in the 1800s was a pretty bad thing. And so misinformation was present in the 1800s. 1890s, we had this thing called yellow journalism, in which both Pulitzer, which later we had this Pulitzer Prize, and other newspapers used fairly fact-less headlines that were sensationalistic in nature. And so it's interesting, maybe only common good comes about when a community is under stress, whether it's like World War II or something else like that, and maybe we're not under stress enough. And maybe it is the case that we're actually having technology that's creating echo chambers. I mean, how many of us know more people online than our immediate neighborhood? How many of us read news articles that are counter to our current political leaning because we want to read them? And so if what the internet is allowing us to do is disassociate us from our own physical environment, maybe there still is shared values, but it's no longer shared values clustered in a specific geographical region. Mm-hmm. But maybe Matt, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, and Divya, else we'll go to the last question.
Well, I used to go around and at least up until COVID, go around the world talking to a lot of different audiences, every country, about how they saw the future. And what was striking to me is, most of them had the same goals, that, we have, so peace, stability, prosperity. I mean, the differences really came about how do you achieve those goals. So I think there is you can say, because we share these common goals, that at least we have some idea of what common good would be. But I do think, the differences, and particularly now, maybe in the US, the differences are foremost in what we share in a common sense are in receding. But, I do think that we can talk about the common good. And, certainly lots of philosophers in the past. I mean, Rousseau was one who believed that there was a common good and common interest. So I and people everywhere do think about, what is the common good. Now, maybe a little different, but most places it's about the same as for us.
Excellent. Thank you, Matt. Divya, do you have any quick rejoinder?
I do. I actually don't think it's a fantasy either. I think Matt's exactly right. If you go around the world and you ask people what matters to them about the people they love and their families and the people they care for, the answers are going to be pretty similar. I think that what we have to do in order to define a common good is to stop looking at people as other. Because when you start categorizing people into these sort of siloed categories, whether it's the fracture lines that exist in the United States along politics or race or everywhere in the world, it's a human tendency to be tribal. And if we find ways of expanding who we think is part of our tribe, I think it's going to be much easier to come to this place of common good.
Excellent. All right, so we've got about 5 minutes left before we wrap. I'll go to Divya, then Matt, and then close before I hand it back to Nicole. We've got the question, which is, what type of non-nation state alliances would you prioritize? And who would be suitable partners? NGOs, large corporations, grassroots organizations, or more? So Divya, what would be your thoughts in terms of, if whether it's the UK, US, or others, who should they partner with?
I'm not 100% sure right now. This is a great question, by the way. It gets almost to the foundational issue of all governance. And I have this fantasy that we could be in this world where we are in these shifting alliances of representational democracy where, you may be a farmer in the Midwest and have more in common with, say, a farmer in Brazil or in Bangladesh than you do with somebody who works in a factory nearby. And, this gets to this whole geographic constraint issue, whether the boundaries of nation states make sense any longer in this sort of globalized, interconnected world we live in. And that maybe shifting alliances might be the way for us to negotiate as a species on this planet and basically, I don't know, highlight and bring rights to all groups.
Excellent. Thank you, Divya. Matt, do you have thoughts?
I think it's actually highly problematic. I mean, if you look at NGOs, I mean, we would think that those are, one of the good ways of engaging others and to have exchanges. But, Russia, China, highly suspicious, sometimes even India, other countries highly suspicious of some, in some cases, all Western NGOs. So it doesn't seem to be a very good platform. I tend to think that we need to develop something like the Helsinki process that we had at the second half of the Cold War, where we institutionalized some of these exchanges, and obviously under that was under a state umbrella, but nevertheless led to some really fruitful, particularly between Soviet Union scientists. I mean, this is a period of Sakharov and others, so that you can get more of those exchanges, lower some of the suspicions. And I do think, as I said before, I think the science networks are particularly good, because I think there is a feeling it's people are, yes, American scientists or Chinese, but they all have a devotion to science and subscribe to, in most cases, the same sort of ethics about science. So that's a good way forward. Whereas in other areas, it's so politicized now that it's very hard to have those exchanges.
Excellent. And maybe if I could build on what both Divya and Matt said, maybe we're asking the wrong question. Maybe it's not about organizations, but it's about networks. And as Divya mentioned, you may have more in common with farmers in other countries than you do with people in your own country in different sectors. We're actually going to play out this hypothesis at the Atlantic Council in November after the election, focusing on what we're calling agritech. Which, as far as we know, knock on wood, is one of the few things that have not become polarizing and weaponized at the moment. But who knows, that may change in a month. But we feel like most people want to feed the planet. They want to make sure they have food, and we can use data and tech to do so. So this is building on what Matt was saying, which is find something that unites those members of the network to work towards a shared goal, even if they have different identities. The last thing I would end is try to find cases where that network that you're building, whether they are with organizations or individuals, adds value to whatever your own goals are, and have that be a shaping function. And that means don't just get with like. If all you do is get with like, as we know, that's a monoculture, that's a recipe for extinction. You may need to have individuals or organizations in your network that intentionally challenge your views, because you'll be better off and not have blind spots. The last thing I would say is thanks again to NSI for allowing this virtual conversation. This is a wonderful example of maybe we could actually have cross-border conversations without ever crossing borders and not having any of the issues. And maybe that's a way forward to actually have cross-border conversations via video, just as long as you don't have to install any executable file, because that might be problematic. But that might be the way forward we could do. So again, want to give thanks to NSI. I also want to give thanks to Divya, Matt, and Jason. Wonderful discussion. Really enjoyed this, and truly enjoy all the questions that our audience asked.
All right. Well, with that, thank you everyone for tuning into this Microsoft Teams session. And thank you, David, Divya, and Matt for presenting today. Also special thanks to Jason, who had to hop off early. But thank you everyone, and have a good rest of your day.
Take care.
Bye.